Welcome to Fast Talk, the Velo News podcast and everything you need to know to ride like a pro.
Bonjour and welcome to Fast Talk. I'm your host, Chris Case, managing editor of Velo News, joined as always by Coach Trevor Connor, who is not French. Right now, the 2019 Tour de France is in full swing. Yesterday, we saw the riders crawl up the steep finishing ramps of La Planche de Belleville, and today, as we speak, they're churning through all 230 kilometers of this year's longest stage. If you're like us, every day for most of July, you're pretending to work while you surreptitiously watch the biggest race of them all, cleverly tucking that live stream behind some important-looking Word document. For 3 weeks, we watched the best bike racers in the world tear themselves apart for 4+ hours per day and wonder, could I ever do something like that? What exactly does it take to race the Tour? Physiologically, mentally, and spiritually. That's what we're talking about today. Each day, these phenomenal athletes race an event that would shatter most of us in a single day. But then they also have to contend with answering reporters' questions, pleasing sponsors, transferring between hotels, trying to eat enough food to cover the day's expenditures, and finally, and perhaps most importantly, trying to get some sleep. It's a feat that's hard to comprehend. So today, we'll try to give a sense of what it takes to race the Tour. We'll cover, first, an overview of the Tour from a numbers perspective, and why the numbers really don't tell the tale. Second, our guest, Ciaran O'Grady, will explain his role as a Tour team physiologist and coach with Dimension Data. Number 3, we'll discuss the many challenges of the Tour outside of racing, including not only what I mentioned above, but also not missing the bus, how to handle the food, what happens when you get sick. Number 4, why getting dropped by the peloton doesn't make for as easy a day as you might think. Number 5, what happens to the riders physiologically over the 3 weeks and why, in essence, it's simply a controlled burnout. Number 6, how riders try to recover day to day, especially when they're dealing with injuries. Number 7, how riders train for the Tour and why having incredible endurance comes first. Then we'll take a deeper dive into how the different types of riders prepare, from GC contenders to stage hunters to domestiques. And finally, we'll try to pull it all together and talk about what us mere mortals should and should not take from Tour riders, whether we're preparing for a weekend race or a 3-day stage race. Our primary guest today is Ciaran O'Grady, one of the team physiologists for the Dimension Data World Tour team. Along with Ciaran, we catch up with one of our favorite guests, Brent Bookwalter of Mitchelton-Scott. Brent has now completed 9 Grand Tours, so he had a lot to say about what it's like getting through 23 grueling days of racing and 2 rest days. We also talked with Hushang Amiri, a former Canadian national and Olympic coach who runs the Pacific Cycling Center. He's coached Tour athletes and had a few thoughts to share on getting athletes ready for a Grand Tour. So get your bidons and your musettes and your baguettes and your crepes. Let's make it fast. This episode of Fast Talk is brought to you by Whoop. And as we discussed several episodes ago with Kate Courtney, Whoop is making headway into the professional athlete space. Kate herself is a big proponent of the strap. We've had Colby Pierce and Frank Overton, 2 prominent coaches in the Boulder area that are big fans of the device. Trevor is a big fan of the device because it is an effective tool for training and recovery.
I even bumped into Dr. Andy Pruitt, who actually had, as I remember, devices on both wrists that were tracking heart rate. One of them was definitely a Whoop.
And if you think about that, some of the best athletes, cyclists, coaches, and cycling experts in the world are using the Whoop strap. Whoop is the performance tool that is changing the way people optimize their training and recovery. Whoop provides a wrist-worn heart rate monitor that features detailed app-based analytics and insights on recovery, strain, and sleep. Whoop tracks sleep quality and heart rate variability 100 times per second, 24 hours per day to help you know when your body is recovered or when it needs rest. You can also use the strap to track workouts and get strain scores that let you know how strenuous the training was on your body. Whoop helps you optimize your sleep based on how fatiguing your day was and tracks sleep performance with insight into your sleep quality, stages of sleep, and consistency. To make things better, Whoop just released the new Whoop Strap 3.0, which includes a suite of new hardware and app features. The Whoop Strap 3.0 now has 5-day battery life, an improved strap, and live heart rate monitoring. A handful of new in-app features, including the new Strain Coach, Improve the way you track and plan your training and recovery. Whoop has provided an offer for Fast Talk listeners to get 15% off their purchase with the code FASTTALK. That's FASTTALK. Just go to whoop.com, that's WHOOP.com, and use the code FASTTALK at checkout to save 15% off and optimize the way you train. So you've heard him on Fast Talk before. It's great to have Ciaran O'Grady back on the podcast. Welcome, Ciaran.
Hi, guys. Thank you very much for having me again. It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. Today, we really want to dive into what could be considered one of the most demanding sporting events in the world, I got to say. The Tour de France, 21 stages, brutal, demanding in every sense of the word, physiologically, psychologically, mentally, spiritually. Everything about it is just stressful. From a from a journalist point of view, it's stressful. I can't imagine what it's like to be there trying to perform every day, stay healthy, ride that hard, do it again the next day, do it again the next day, do it again the next day, and on. Meanwhile, deal with all of the other things that you have to deal with as an athlete, especially if you're wearing a jersey or winning a stage or battling for the overall, and having to deal with people like myself and Fred Dreyer sticking a microphone in your face 30 seconds after you've just punished yourself up Alpe d'Huez. So we want to talk about the Tour de France and the demands of Grand Tours. So we're glad Ciaran O'Grady, who works with Dimension Data, can be here to join us and fill us in on the other side of the Tour de France. So let's start with giving a little bit of the flavor of the Tour de France from the numbers side of things. You know, the numbers don't tell the full story, obviously, but Ciaran, maybe you could fill us in, give us some sense in terms of the data that the guys in the Tour de France are putting out.
Compared to everyday cyclists and mere mortals, it's absolutely astonishing what these guys go through over those 21 stages. So over the whole 3 weeks, they'll be averaging around sort of 95 to 100 hours of racing, and that's sort of not include anything extra that they might do in terms of warming up for time trials and things like that, rest day rides. 3,500 to 3,800 kilometers. That's a lot of riding over undulating terrain. Some of that's sort of flatter stages. In terms of the energy demands, you're looking at 60,000 to 80,000 kilojoules over the whole 3 weeks. Obviously, that depends on things like the size of the rider, the role of the rider. Someone who's possibly more a domestique might burn 75 to 80,000 kilojoules easily, just because they're going to be in the wind a lot more. And then when it gets hilly, they're pushing out a lot more to get over the climbs, and daily basis they could be over 4,500 kilojoules, 5,000 kilojoules of energy just trying to survive in the mountains. But consider then, when you look at the average power over the 21 stages, it can be as low as 170 watts for some light climbers who are in protected roles, who spend a lot of the time in the wheels, protected, and then just have those sudden moments of very, very high power outputs. But on the most, they're going to have lower absolute powers anyway, being a lot lighter. But then the bigger domestiques might have average powers over the 21 stages of about 250, 260 watts, which doesn't sound like much, but it's a lot of, if you're holding that for 110 hours, it's going to certainly add up in terms of physiological load.
Yeah, we were going to ask about that because I actually found a really interesting recent study that just came out last year that showed some of the numbers for a typical tour rider. So they analyzed all the data for 9 riders at the Tour de France, all on the same team. And the numbers were something that I would expect to see doing a local race. So for example, the flat stage tended to average around 196 watts in a flat stage of the Tour. So that works out to about 2.68 watts per kilogram. For the hilly stages, 217 watts. For the mountain stages, 254. This doesn't seem extraordinary.
Yeah, I would agree with that. When you look at it on paper like that as a pure average, you would think, oh, I can do that. But when you look into the files of these riders, and I would take someone like Bernie Eisel, for example, who might be covering moves at the start of a stage, so he's going to have some pretty high power outputs to sort of close gaps and monitor riders going off the front at the very beginning. But then for the middle 2-3 hours, everything kind of gets a bit more sedate. So once the breakaway is formed for the day, and all of the big GC teams and controlling teams are happy with that composition, they're going to protect that time gap and just ride to a steady tempo. So anyone who's in the bunch can actually just tick along quite nicely, as long as it's not a super hilly stage. And then you kind of get an inverted a U-shaped power output profile. So very hard at the beginning, more sedate in the middle, and then towards the final hour of racing, kicks back up again. So it's kind of offset. The average is the sort of middle. So it goes very, very hard when it does go hard. And then they do take it quite easy when they don't need to.
It's almost kind of a training pace, huh?
Yeah. And just ticking over, you look at some of the files and you think, if you were just to take out a section of them in the middle, where possibly after a feed zone, things can look fairly easy, and you would think that this was a section of a rest day file, but then you zoom out and you see that it's part of a 6-hour slog, but it's just one moment of downtime. But everything's tactical. If someone's taking it easy, there's probably someone on the front who's sort of ticking over at 280 to 300 watts, which will tick along the bunch and just pull everyone along at a lot lower power. So the kind of average powers there's always going to be someone who's working hard, but it's kind of offset against everyone else.
The other thing they had in this study that really surprised me, which you're talking to, is they analyzed all these riders' data in terms of they put it into the 3 zones. So your zone 1 being your easy base pace type riding, your zone 3 being that really high intensity, and then zone 2 being that in between, so the sweet spot or no man's land. And looking at flat, hilly, and even mountain stages, riders were spending 70% or more of their time in zone 1 at just that slow training pace.
The majority of this is an incredibly endurance event. It's over 90 to 100 hours, so it's going to have to be prolonged sub-threshold pace. It's inevitable that's going to happen. So when you look at the time spent above threshold for a lot of these guys, it's sort of round about 10 to 15% of the total time. So it doesn't sound like much on paper, but when you add it up over the course of 21 stages, it's a fair old physiological whack.
A fair old physiological whack. I like it. That's the tour in a nutshell.
Brent Bookwalter with Mitchelton-Scott has become such a feature of Grand Tours that this morning when I turned on the tour instead of editing this podcast like I should have, I could have sworn I saw Brent on the front of the field. So now that I've quoted a study and made it sound, by the numbers, like the tour is not that hard, let's hear from someone who actually has a right to talk about the demands of the tour.
Physiological demands of the tour are just massive. Yeah, I think the sort of cliched analysis of that, versus the other Grand Tours is that, maybe the Tour de France is similar or even less than the Giro or other Grand Tours, and it's always the nerves and the stress and the sponsor pressure and the heightened microscope of the tour that makes it so selective and so dramatic and difficult. But I think that's true to some extent, but you can't take away from just the massive load of the tour. If you look at just the general template and the hours and the volume, and then the intensity and how fought almost every meter of every one of those stages fought. It's just a huge intensity load. It's a huge volume load. And you can really feel when you're in that race that it is the world's best cyclists all on the best form of the season, many the best form of their lives. It's such a deep field.
So I guess my question is, when you watch the commentators, they're always talking about the strategy and when is somebody going to attack and when is this going to happen? When is that going to happen? From experience, how much of the race is about racing the event and how much of it is about getting through, about surviving?
Yeah, definitely. I think that depends on who you ask and what their role is in the race and at what phase of the race you're in. I think if I look back to my first tour in 2010, I'd say at least half of the race, if not more, was about surviving. It was just a massive battle of survival. And then with that, a desire to want to contribute and support my teammates and our team leader as much as I could too. So it's this dynamic of like panicking to get my head above water. And then as soon as I get my head above water, using everything I got and then just be sinking, drowning again, and then scrambling to get up to the surface and then just get pushed under again. And I think that's sort of lost. I think because because everyone is in such good form and the line is so fine and it's so competitive and the stakes are so high, everything at the tour is so calculated and, efforts aren't wasted and risks, the long bomb isn't really thrown as much as maybe it is in other races because there is so much riding on it. And this is the livelihood we're talking about of us athletes. And this is the future and the security of these teams and these organizations that employ, hundreds of people. So it needs to be tactical and it needs to be very thought out because there isn't a room to be unthoughtful with your effort or, rash with a decision.
Did you ever have moments where you were just sitting there going, I'm not sure I'm going to last another hour, and then your team manager gets on the radio and asks you to do something crazy and you somehow were able to dig deep and do it?
100%. I think that's the reality of a Grand Tour, and that's what makes them so amazing and beautiful when you're on the other side of them is realizing what you've accomplished physically and mentally that you didn't think was possible. And that it's just that sort of phenomena that happens over and over. It's a lot of comeback from the dead moments, and it's just a huge testament to what the mind and the body are capable of, and the willpower. It's a huge battle of wills, I think, with each rider within themselves, and then also amongst each other. It's who's giving up first, who throws in the towel first. And since, like I said, the level is so high and the competition is so deep, and there's so much anticipation and so much build up, and everyone knows it's the center stage, the biggest stage, and you never know if it's the last one. Maybe it's the last one you're ever going to do. So much heart and soul and grit is poured into it. It doesn't make sense. I don't know. When I think about the moments that I pulled myself out of in those races and how I've gotten through from one day to the next, it doesn't seem like it's possible, but somehow it is. And I guess that's, to a large extent, that's the beauty of it. And hopefully in some way or some even small percentage that's captured and shared with the fans, because I think that it's something everyone can sort of marvel at and hopefully enjoy.
So how do you make yourself do that? How, when you're that fatigued and that tired and you've got a job to do, how do you make yourself do it?
Use all my tricks. Yeah, I mean, some of it is we are hardwired. You see that with guys bouncing off the ground and crashes. We train and focus and mentally prepare and physically prepare for so long that, you see a guy hit the ground, even break a bone, rip a bunch of skin off their body, and they're still like back on the bike, even if they shouldn't be, before someone can even get a second to check them out. So I think, when I'm in those hard moments and I feels like I'm up against the world and I can't do any more, there's still like this sort of subconscious drive, and sort of some of it's maybe innate, not trained, natural. Maybe some of that's what makes us able to race at the professional level, but it's also something that's trained and worked on and practiced and crafted for after years and years and years and, thousands of hours on the bike and pushing through, really hard training sessions and having the meaning there, knowing that it is so much more than myself. It's for my team. It's for what we're trying to accomplish, greater than oneself. And even deeper than that, it's also for, my whole team. It's for my family that has kept me going and pushed me along the whole way. And it's for, my coaches and doctors and my physical therapists who have pieced me back together when I've been hurt, and my mental trainers that I've worked with, and my friends that have a beer with me and counsel me and console me when it all seems like it's gone bad. It's for all those, all those hours that you sort of have to dig into those and tap into that and know you're doing it for just more than just a sporting performance.
That's a great way to think about it. Let's get back to the show and hear what Dr. O'Grady has to say about this year's tour.
Stages that are interesting, for example, would be like stage 5 of this year coming up. There's 3 climbs in the last 75k, and they're all pretty long with pretty hairy descents. So it's going to be an exciting one to watch, and just to see how the riders then play that, who's in the break, whether a team puts riders up the road ahead of the game to try and have some cards to play later in the race if everything comes back together. You might have a set of fairly fresh legs from the breakaway instead of a rider who's spent the whole day in the peloton fighting up those climbs, fighting for positions on those narrow roads. So it's all a big game of chess with regards to what happens on which stages. But the sprint stages are generally seen as the most simple stages tactically. Break goes away, gets X amount of minutes, usually if it's a fairly fairly flat stage and no problem for the sprinters teams to control, then they might get upwards of 8, 9, 10 minutes of a time gap that will just slowly be pulled back and then towards the sprint finish at the end.
So you said the sprint stage is fairly simple. There's a breakaway that goes. I've always wanted to ask this from somebody who's working on the inside. Every team really wants that breakaway to happen, right? Because that's when the field's going to slow down. Until that breakaway goes, it's quite, as you said, you're putting on a lot of high wattage. You're responding to a lot of attacks. So there's an advantage to having a breakaway up the road, correct?
Yes, yeah, massively. It's got to be the right sort of composition, and that your viewpoint on what the right composition of the breakaway is would depend on what team you're in. So there'll be pretty much all the French teams, all the wild cards would want to be in those breaks on the flat stages. That's a lot of TV time, and that's a lot of real publicity for those sponsors. So that's invaluable for them. That's gold dust. But you also don't want anybody that could also potentially launch a late move from a breakaway, and just trying to make sure that then they're sort of fairly good caliber, that they're actually going to last the distance. They're not going to blow up 30k from the finish and then everything status quo again and it all gets aggressive again. But you have some days where on the sprints everything goes in the first move and 4 guys go up the road and all the teams look at each other and they'll go, yep, this is the right break for today. We can take it easy now. And then the problems happen is when 80% of the teams are happy, but then 2 teams then say, no, we don't like that. We're going to chase it down. And then it gets brought back together and then another group goes up the road and it's like sort of constantly rolling the dice and just saying, no, don't like that. No, don't like that. And until you get the one that you do. So you kind of need to have that group consensus. Or then if it was just maybe one team that doesn't like it and they're not strong enough to really bring it back, then they've got to kind of live with it for the whole day and know that they've kind of not done their job properly.
So that's what I was going to ask you is there any discussion and negotiation between the teams?
A lot of the time that discussion will be done through the team captains. So on the road captains themselves, they'll kind of make the call because they'll be talking to each other. They might have discussed before the stage. It doesn't sound like they have a meeting, like a round table discussion, but it'll just be in that start zone chit chat that you might hear that this guy wants to go in the break or Thomas de Gent might want to go in the break, and then everyone kind of goes, oh yeah, okay. So when Thomas de Gent moves, then he's likely to get in the break or something like that. So there's always those discussions, and then if there's any big problems, then that's when the team directors from the cars will radio through and say, okay, no, this guy's dangerous, or we don't want this breakaway gone, it's not the right composition, and that will be chased down.
What role are you playing on a day-to-day basis during the tour? It seems like from the outside as a physiologist, a lot of your work is geared towards getting the guys ready to be at the tour, but what are you doing once the tour has started?
So at Dimension Data, we have kind of different roles for each race. So there'll always be a lead physiologist, lead sports scientist on the race. And for the tour this year, it's Dr. Daniel Green. So he's going to be heading up. He's going to be there. One of our primary roles is running the time trial days. So we plan everything on the time trial days, make sure it runs without a hitch. And if there are any problems on that day, it kind of, the buck stops with us. We've not done something right, probably. But then on a more day-to-day, on the normal stages, we monitor the weight of the athletes, we look at their power files. So generally the lead physiologist will send out a report that day with an analysis of the rider's files and how they did, along with a comment from the rider and a comment from the DS, just so we can get a full overview of what happened that stage. And then me personally, I will be sort of just monitoring the riders that I will work with as a sort of more detailed description, and I'll be discussing with them usually over Skype, or if I'm going to be there for a few stages, so it will be sort of face-to-face discussions. And it's always important to have those face-to-face discussions so that when you are talking about a stage, you can kind of look in their eyes and see, do they mean what they're saying, or are they're just trying to tell you what they think you want to hear? So that's always important. But generally it's all about performance analysis.
So that brings up an interesting point, of which we haven't talked about yet, which are all of those demands that don't happen on the bike, all the demands off the bike, interviews they might have to do, the transfers after the stages, some short, some long, sleeping in foreign beds every night, injuries that might come up. It seems like it would be really hard to quantify the impact of all of those things, but it seems like it has a massive impact on how well each rider is doing day to day. Could you give us a sense, Ciaran, of the impact, the substance there, and how you deal with it?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a massive sort of underappreciation of what these guys go through on a day by day basis. So this one, that for example, is criterium de Dauphiné stage 8. Yeah, the riders would wake up at whatever time they really want to, but as long as they're down at by breakfast time, which, for example, is 9:30, then usually if they're changing hotels, they'll have to bring down their suitcase. So that means that they've got to kind of pack up everything. Some riders are messier than others. So some riders are quite quick at packing. Other riders, I look in their rooms and think, how are you going to get all this together in some sort of a semblance of an order? But they manage it anyway. And then, so for example, they might get suitcases down to the bus 10:45. They might drive to the hotel drive to the start from the hotel at 11 o'clock, and then sign-ons are usually around midday. So as long as it's not sort of super long stage, this one was quite short, for example, 113k. So they signed on at midday, and then the neutral start was 1:45. But in that time, there's a lot of prepping on the bus, getting ready, making sure the radios are sort of comfortable and secured, making sure if they need to repin their numbers or restick them. Some of them have sticky adhesive on the back. There's always the decision of what clothing to wear. I heard it joked that the day that a rider knows exactly what to wear on a stage is the day that they've retired, because there's always that indecision. This guy's wearing his arm warmers. Do I wear my arm warmers, or do I put on my base layer? It's a bit of mind game sometimes with what you do wear. The whole leg warmers in the classics, and if you're just doing a training race sort of thing. But the demands of the morning are fairly slow. But then once they get going, then they race. But once they finish, if they've done anything in the stage, they'll be pressed. There'll be a couple of hours of interviews, and then there's also team interviews. So social media guys from the team will probably want to get a video or some comments that will be put out. So I feel like these guys just race and then get cameras stuck in their face, but that's kind of part of the job. That's what.
Sorry, guys. Sorry. Yeah. That's me.
Yeah, it's an important part. It's got to happen. I think some of these guys want to be juniors again so that they don't have to deal with it. But I think there are some guys that are great about it and will just happily do it and know when to say no. If they really don't want to do an interview, they just say no, not today, and head to the bus instead of just being a grumpy interviewer.
Yeah, right.
But, I'm sure you've had a fair few of them.
Yep.
But probably what most people don't realize with the demands that you don't consider is the amount of logistics that go on. Teams might have 4 to 5, sometimes 6 cars going, a bus, a truck. Usually there's a catering truck as well, and then any sort of special guests that do attend the race might have their own car. So there's a fierce logistics, and trying to not forget someone is actually quite a real challenge. You want to make sure that when you've left the hotel, you've had a discussion with the director sportif, you've made the plan for the next day. I'm leaving this hotel at this time with this car with these 2 riders. And if you leave the hotel without one of those, even if they've come up and said, I'm going to go in this other DS's car, then you need to 100% make sure that they are leaving in their car. Because if it's not in the plan and that director then just says, okay, I've got these 2 riders who are originally supposed to be in my car, then that rider can be stuck at the hotel.
So you could end up a real Home Alone situation where rider waking up going, guys,
where is the team?
Yeah. But the thing is, they've probably brought all the race food and the goodies with them as well. The snacks and stuff is probably left with all the soigneurs. So yeah, they might not be too happy after a couple of hours.
Has that ever happened? Are you aware of a rider being left at the hotel?
It's bound to have happened. I can't think of an example off the top of my head.
There's a famous example of Contador getting left at the hotel, but there were some team politics going on at the time, so that wasn't necessarily because he was forgotten. There was Lance Armstrong was also on the team, and supposedly, and maybe this doesn't go into the podcast, or maybe it does. I don't know how well this story has been vetted, but supposedly it was intentional that they left him behind. And there was some people that say, oh, his brother / agent Fran was going to take him to the start. And then Contador's people were saying, no, you left me at the start intentionally, so I'd missed the start, et cetera, et cetera. So again, maybe that doesn't, maybe that's not the best example, because it's not about just, oh my God, we forgot Bernie Eisel. We forgot about Mark Cavendish at the hotel. Somebody go back and get him quick.
It's a very real challenge that you've really got to make sure that you have everyone at the race.
So the story I heard, I don't know if this is an urban myth or not, but this was, I'm blanking on his name right now, but a big Australian sprinter who retired about 5-6 years ago. Late in his career, he was at the Giro d'Italia, and there was a young rider on the team who he had taken under his wings. So before the start of the stage, he sat down at a coffee shop right beside the course with this kid to talk with him for a little bit. And while they were talking, the field passed by the coffee shop. They realized they had missed the start.
Oops.
So he just looks at the kid and goes, "We're in for a hard day."
Welcome to the pro racing, kid.
And apparently the two of them did a team time trial for 80 kilometers or something like that until they finally caught the field.
Mm.
Yeah, that's a long day.
Yep. So what are some of the other challenges that the riders have to get through day after day in order to survive an event like this? So we talked about the transitions, packing up every day because they're almost in a different hotel every time. They finish a stage, they're hurting, and then they have cameras put in their face and microphones put in the face. Are there any other big challenges that they're dealing with? Or after that, is it go home, get a massage, eat, and go to bed?
Yeah, I was gonna say you stole my suggestion. I was gonna say eating. It's, you'd think these guys would be able to eat no problem, but sometimes just after racing so much, it's really struggling to keep your appetites and to bring in the amount of calories that these guys need to replenish after a stage. After each stage, we email them with a recommendation in terms of nutritional guidance for the rest of the evening and hydration and stuff. But you'll be amazed at how much calories these guys have to take in, even though they've eaten on the bike. Most of it's sort of in the extreme or very high carbohydrate intake, just to replenish and recoup, especially if the next day is a tough mountain stage or something, or a short, sharp stage. But just simply taking in that amount of energy is, I don't want to say superhuman, but it's incredible what these guys do. But they're constantly eating, constantly grazing, nibbling, and the food room is generally a soigneur's room that's kept open all the time, and it's stocked with sort of nibbles and food and grains and nuts that the riders can go in and just grab whatever they want. If it's after dinner and they just want something to snack on before bedtime, then they can go in and replenish the stores there. So everything's tried to be managed as much as possible, but it's always a challenge.
Do they run into digestive issues trying to consume that much food every day?
Yes, yeah, massively so. But that's where having a good team chef comes in. So we've got two team chefs that work with the team over the Tour de France, and they'll keep the palettes really varied so that there's always some new flavors, but everything's very digestible. We have Tom van der Gracht, who's a great experienced chef. He knows exactly what the riders will need, and he works with our sports nutritionists to make sure that that's the right timing, type, and quantity of food. It can be when a rider does sometimes they just pick up a stomach bug from someone, I don't know, a fan who they shook hands with or had a selfie with. Then that's when problems start, because if they decide, I want to see if I can continue and push through this, then, these guys are doing huge stages, burning huge amounts of calories, but not really able to take anything back in and, absorb the nutrients completely. So it can be a real challenge about how do you then try to fuel these guys. So a lot of the riders turn to very plain foods, very simple. So move away completely from race foods, very high energy foods, to more traditional, what a more normal person might eat, and whole foods, sandwiches and things like that. Smoothies are quite a popular one if you do have digestive issues. But yeah, usually if a rider is going to get over it, they'll have a couple of days of hell, and then they're starting to come back.
If they got a stomach bug, so what? Deal with it. You keep racing.
Yeah, well, it's a big call of the doctors whether they do continue. So they'll be looking at it from the rider's health point of view and saying, is this going to do them damage? If the answer is no, and they can just suffer through and push through whatever, a bug or something that's not going to have any sort of prolonged negative impact on the rider, they'll give them the green light and say, okay, you're to suffer, but you're not going to do any damage.
And this is the stuff that's going on every day that the casual fan doesn't often think about or see, because these guys are in their own little private hells dangling at the back of the peloton, just trying to get through the stage. And it's very rare when something like this is visible. Case in point, Tom Dumoulin taking his pants down on the side of the road at the Giro a couple of years ago and having his issues, but it's usually not so visible like that. But I bet you're dealing with this almost every day at the Tour.
Yeah, and to a lesser extent on every stage race, there's always problems whenever you're racing back-to-back days like that. And we had one rider who had a pretty rough Giro d'Italia with a bit of illness, stomach illness, this year, and I must have had 250 voice notes over the 3 weeks, just because to simply type was just too much, too much stress almost. So just to hold down the record button and just talk was a lot easier for him, and it was good because he then managed to just ramble, and a lot of the sort of true feelings came out. So when everyone switches off their telly and the stage is over, that's when a lot of the hard work starts with the team and support staff.
And yeah, I guess one other thing to point out that a lot of people don't realize is you think in the race, the riders are very well supported. And if you're at the front, that's true. You have the caravan behind you. But if you're one of those riders who gets popped on the mountain stage 3 hours from the finish, you're outside the caravan, you're on your own. And my understanding is a lot of them are handed a water bottle as they go past their team car, and that's what they have to survive on for the 2-3 hours to the finish.
Yeah, you never want to be in that situation as a rider. It's not a good feeling, and it's okay if you've got a gruppetto, and then maybe one team will sacrifice a team car that will stay behind and just have loads of bottles and some spare wheels, rim brake, disc brake, just to kind of be almost a neutral support for that gruppetto. But generally when a sole rider is dropped early or something and they can't make it back, that's a soul destroying day. It's a physiologically tough day as well, because you've no shelter. You've absolutely no support. There's no one unless someone does drop back with you and tries to pace you on, but then you kind of start to burn two guys instead of just one guy. So it's a call by the directors. Do we sacrifice this guy in the hope that he may or may not come back? Or do we burn another guy who may be important for that stage or the next stage, just to try to help this guy get back on? It's sometimes a game of massive emotional chess.
Whoop is the performance tool that is changing the way people optimize their training and recovery. Whoop provides a wrist-worn heart rate monitor that features detailed app-based analytics and insights on recovery, strain, and sleep. Whoop tracks sleep quality and heart rate variability 100 times per second, 24 hours per day to help you know when your body is recovered or when it needs rest. You could also use the strap to track workouts and get strain scores to let you know how strenuous the training was on your body. Whoop helps you optimize your sleep based on how fatiguing your day was and tracks sleep performance with insights into sleep quality, stages of sleep, and consistency. To make things better, Whoop just released the new Whoop Strap 3.0, which includes a suite of new hardware and app features. The Whoop Strap 3.0 now has 5-day battery life, an improved strap, and live heart rate monitoring. A handful of new in-app features, including the new Strain Coach, improve the way you track and plan your training and recovery. Whoop has provided an offer for Fast Talk listeners to get 15% off their purchase with the code FASTTALK. That's FASTTALK, so 2 T's, no space. Just go to whoop.com, that's WHOOP.com, and use the code FASTTALK at checkout to save 15% off and optimize the way you train.
Maybe we now take a little bit deeper dive into the physiological impact of Grand Tour, of the Tour de France, of a stage race like this, and talk about the effects on the body over the 3 weeks. Are we talking about a steady decline? Are we talking about you come in a little bit rested to hope to peak in that third week? What are the demands that we're talking about from a more specific level here?
Yes, so a lot of that will depend on what the role of the rider is and whether they need to be performing at a specific time in the tour. They need to be a sprinter who's ready for the first few stages. That will come in quite fresh, but with lots of intensities in the last few days, just to make sure that peak power is firing properly. But generally for the Grand Tour winners and the sort of top 20 guys, they will almost come into it with the idea that they'll be a bit undercooked, but the first 2 weeks will bring them up in terms of performance. But I say bring them up, but for a lot of them, it's not reduce in performance as much as anyone else. So for example, most athletes will decline massively in performance over the 3 weeks. There's just an inevitable, it's not really burnout, but it's just an overwhelming fatigue that accompanies the 3 weeks of racing. So your power outputs might drop 40-50 watts across the board just because you've been doing it for 3 weeks. But a Grand Tour winner might, they don't lose anything, or they might lose 5 to 10 watts or something. So it's always a challenge of trying to get through it as fresh as possible. The neurological fatigue and the resting heart rate changes that we see over the course of the tour, it does just indicate that depending on the role of the rider, some of them are quite quick. If they're a domestique that's working very heavily in the first few sprint stages and the lead outs and in the chase downs, then yeah, that will start to load fairly quickly. And it's the director sportive's role to then take the information that we feed from them. This guy is getting pretty cooked. Maybe take it easy on him the next day, give him a bit more of a freelance role and just see how he feels. It's an important management tool to look at the physiology and how it changes and the fatigue of the riders.
So you brought up a really interesting point, that whole neurological fatigue. And I've read about that you, as you said, you see the resting heart rate go up. You also see a big heart rate depression in the race. By the end of the tour, guys just their heart rate won't come up to anywhere close to what used to be their max values. I also just downloaded an interesting study that showed that for the couple weeks after the tour, riders' power is way down. It does seem like it's almost a bit of a controlled burnout or overreach.
Yeah, no, I think I know the paper that you're on about. Really nice study, just looking at the performance testing before and immediately before and after the Grand Tour. And, you see VO2 max is down from sort of up in the 80s to down in the 75s. And everyone thinks that, VO2 max is pretty stable, but that's a massive decline. And that's a massive amount of fatigue from 3 weeks of racing. And you can see it in the heart rate suppression, goes down by about, approximately about 10, 15 beats per minute across the riders that we can see. What we also collect is sort of daily fatigue, sort of subjective fatigue. So the riders every morning and after each stage will give us feedback through an iPhone app or an Android app. And that will be sort of muscle soreness, fatigue, motivation, things like that. So we can track as you go through a Grand Tour how that changes. Most are fairly obvious that as you go through a Grand Tour, the muscle soreness and fatigue will go up. But then you see as stages get changeable, if you have a flat stage, the climbers might actually recover a lot better because they might be supported. They might have a very, very easy day. And then it's almost like an active recovery for 3 hours with a little bit of hard intensity at the end. So they come into that next stage feeling actually I'm okay now. I can then go again the next day. So it's a very individual thing about how each rider recovers over the course of the 3 weeks.
So one other question I have for you about the recovery side. Some of these stages are 6+ hours. You're really looking at a big part of your day actually being racing. So is there anything they would do in the actual race itself to start the recovery process even before the race is over?
Yeah, so sometimes if the rider isn't necessarily needing a huge amount of high energy foods towards the end of a stage, they might start to bring in a lot more protein, maybe have a protein bar in the last hour of the race. But hydration in the last hour is quite a key one, because if you're dehydrated at the end of a stage, it then takes even longer to kind of kick that recovery process in, because the body is trying to recover from the dehydration. So if anything, it's just make sure you're hydrated and get going there. But a lot of the riders will just chew a cheeky protein bar and start to metabolize those amino acids and get them to the bases that are needed for recovery. But also, for example, if it is a sprint stage and the rider's done their job already, they have a choice of, do I stick with the bunch and potentially stay at 250 to 300 watts average, or do I back off the back of the bunch and spin home at 100 watts, but make sure I stay in the time cut? So it can be quite a tactical decision by them to sit up and say, yep, that's it. I'm done for today. This is my cool down essentially into the finish.
So imagine that has to be really true for domestiques. I mean, when you're a rider who you're going to have many, many days where you're sitting on the front, killing yourself for several hours working for the team, if you have any opportunity to ride easy, you just don't care about your own time in the race. You're just going to back off and keep it as easy as possible so you're ready for the next time you're on the front with your tongue hanging down.
Yeah, it is a big game of chess. Sometimes sacrificing your own position and finishing minutes within the time cut is actually preferential from an overall team point of view. I mean, there is the overall team classification, but that's another story. But from a rider functionality, if they've done their job and they're not expected to do anything or not able to do anything more in the stage, then getting through the rest with as little energy expenditure as possible. You don't want someone to burn themselves out just trying to finish 60th and actually help, contribute nothing to the win, but just so that they can say they finished 60th instead of finishing, 120th and finishing within the time cut. So it can be quite tactical sometimes, and some riders need reminding more than others.
So in terms of other things that you might suggest to guys after the stages, I assume that everybody's getting massage on a daily basis. Are there other things that you're doing to enhance recovery between these stages?
Yeah, most people get massages. I know some riders who don't. Don't think there's anyone on our team who doesn't get massages, but there are some out there who don't like them and just get on with it without massage. But after the massage, or even before the massage on the bus home, they might whip out some Normatec boots, which are like cryotherapy sort of compression boots that will help speed up the recovery process. We work with the doctors a lot to make sure that they get the right sort of nutrients and supplements after the stage. So protein bottles are made up, ready for the rider, specific to them based on their weight and how much protein they need following the race. Each one year will work with a specific rider over the course of a Grand Tour, so they'll know what the rider needs day by day. So everyone thinks sports massage for a cycling stage race would be just legs, but sometimes they need to address something in their back and their legs are actually fine, but it's the problem in the back that might be referring down into the legs and causing more fatigue, more pain. So sometimes it can be quite interesting watching a sports massage going on at a tour, because you're thinking, massaging his shoulder, he didn't crash on his shoulder, but you talk to the soigneur and they're like, oh yeah, his shoulder was affecting this muscle which goes down and sort of switches off the right glute, which is causing the left leg to work a lot more than it should be.
And so that brings up the question about the more extreme recovery, which is you had a rider who crashed, they're injured, and they're continuing to race. What are you doing to help them continue to race as close to their best as they can and recover from those injuries?
Yeah, so a lot of treatment from the doctor, making sure that those wounds are clean and well dressed each day, because you don't want any infection. If you get an infection in a wound, that can be a potential tour ending incident. But if it's just a nice clean wound that you can cover with some gauze and swabs, then as long as it's not too painful to sleep, because that's probably the biggest thing. Once you're on the bike and moving, you can deal with the pain, but it's when you wake up in the middle of the night and you've stuck to the sheets, and the reason you've woken up is because you've rolled over and pulled all of the scabs off your leg and side. So the most challenging thing is probably the sleep aspect of an injury, if it's just superficial skin. But you hear some war stories of guys who have broken bones and just put kinesio tape over their shoulder and said, yep, I'm continuing, it's 2 days left of the tour and I'm gonna muscle through.
Cyclists are crazy. We all know
That's
it.
cycling for you.
That gets us back to, you mentioned the team as a sports psychologist. As a psychologist ever just gone, they're voluntarily doing a 3-week stage race. They're all nuts. I can't help here.
It certainly might be different levels of insanity.
Okay, so let's talk about the training for the tour. And I think one of the things I want to ask you about first is going back to that study I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation. They show the sort of peak wattages these riders were putting out. It's a kind of a small version of a power duration curve. And when I looked at these numbers, I was frankly not that overwhelmed. So for example, their peak 5-second power was around the biggest that they saw was about 982. You continue down the list, the biggest 1 minute power was 510, and believe it or not, in the time trial. Get to 5 minutes, the biggest they were seeing was around 423 watts or 5.83 watts per kilogram. Get out to 20 minutes, and you're seeing in the time trial in the mountain stages around 375 watts or 5.1 watts per kilogram. So I look at all of this and go, I can do all those numbers, and I wouldn't last 30 minutes in the Tour de France. So it seems like training isn't about, for a Grand Tour, isn't about what's the biggest 5 minute, what's the biggest 20-minute power you can put out. It seems like the focus is elsewhere. Is that, what are these riders doing when they're training?
In order to sort of talk about the training process to get ready for the Tour de France, you need to sort of appreciate that it's going to be 100 hours. So one of the first training considerations that you need to sort of have in your mind, okay, they're going to need to be able to manage that pure volume on the bike. So in the winter and the base phase of their training program, they're probably going to have months where the training load is going to be 100, 110 hours just to get that time on the bike. And so that when they do a Grand Tour and have those 21 stages of 90 to 100 hours, that they're not completely cooked by the end of it. So you build that sort of reception to the volume, and then you can work on the intensity above that. But most of these guys, by the time they do a Grand Tour, they've been pro for several years. Their oxidative capacity, their endurance engine is going to be super well developed. So simply doing 100 hours of, you were seeing the average power outputs, it's fairly low as an average. And then all you need to then work on is their ability to work under fatigue. So when you are training, you're going to be doing blocks of days and then doing, I don't know if this is the technical term, but this is what I call it. I'd call them dirty intervals. So you say, okay, 3 hours, you go out and ride for 3 hours at fairly sort of tempo pace, burn X amount of kilojoules, maybe 2,500, 3,000 kilojoules. And that's when you start your intervals. So it's making sure that the body is able to work then under fatigue. And when you do that day by day by day, and then have the proper recovery and sort of adaptive processes, you will be able to perform in a Grand Tour environment, if you've got the genetic predisposition to do so as well.
I like that name. I like the dirty interval name. So I watched one of the Pro Tour riders here in Boulder. I was watching some of his rides on Strava, and I noticed he had one that he did a few times where his coach would have him go out and do a couple Category 1 climbs, not for him that particularly hard, but he'd go out and do a bunch of these climbs, get 3-4 hours in the legs, and then his coach would take him out and motor pace him for 2 hours. Same sort of idea is get a little bit fatigued, and then I'm going to take you out and make you just ride at 50, 55 kilometers an hour.
Yeah, that's a extremely common technique, and especially in the last couple of days before the tours, maybe doing a slightly shorter one of those just as a last physiological kick to prime the engines for the first stage, especially if that's a rider who's really wanted to go out and do well in the first few stages.
So I'm sure you're familiar with this study that came out in 2014 that was put out by Dr. Pinault, looking at 6 years of Pierre Rolland's training. Are you familiar with this one?
Yes, yeah.
Fascinating study. And they showed some of this, that so what they were calling his anaerobic numbers, so his short duration powers, 5-second power, 30-second power, 1 minute power, they said really didn't change much over those 6 years as he built up to being a top 10 finisher at the Tour. What they showed was exactly what you were talking about, was the volume over those 6 years went up 79%. So just bigger and bigger volume. And you really saw a development of that aerobic engine, that endurance side, that ability to resist fatigue. And one of the things they point out is he had these weeks that were extremely stressful, really hard, big volume, big intensity weeks. And they said at the start of this 6 years, he did only 3 of those in a year. By the time he was top 10 at the Tour de France, he was doing 11 of those training weeks in a year. So it seems like really the focus wasn't let's build that big, huge power. It was more exactly what you're talking about, is that resistance to the grind.
Yeah, massively. So there's not huge development in sprint power. That's going to be very, very minor, and even the 1 minute power is going to be very small changes. But the ability to then do the 5 to 40 minute efforts at a higher power output, that's where big changes are made, and the endurance, that sort of 2, 3, 4 hour sort of sustainable power under fatigue. That's one of the biggest changes as a Pro Tour rider will mature, is just developing those long-term physiological changes that are more than you see on that annual basis. It's the compounding of adaptations that get made just year after year after year of training like a pro. So it's not really something that you can do for 1 year, train like a pro, and expect to be at that level. It's got to be something that you've got to invest a lot of time to, years and years and years of training and racing at that sort of intensity, because you will train individual parts of the race, but there's nothing that beats doing a Grand Tour and getting that physiological load that 21 stages of hard work will get you, and then you recover and make that big jump forward. So a lot of riders then perform exceptionally well in stage races or 1 day races after the tours.
Well, a short stage race after doing the tour has to feel like a quick walk in the park.
Yeah, it's quite nice for something, and for some riders they quite like doing it, because if you have a long gap after a stage race, you can kind of get into a bit of a lull in your training, that if you don't have something to focus on, you've spent 3 weeks racing hard where everything is planned on a day by day basis, and now you're on your own. You've got your training schedule, but you can say that you feel tired and not necessarily do the intervals on a day, because you don't have anything 2, 3, 4 weeks later where you need to perform at. So sometimes having that race on the horizon is a good feeling for some riders.
Past Canadian national coach Ciaran has not only worked with tour athletes, but he has worked with cyclists who have won stages and even won Grand Tours. We asked him what it takes to train for the tour. What really came across is just how advanced these riders need to be before they can even start preparing for a tour.
You have trained athletes for Grand Tours, so my question to you is, as a coach, how do you train a cyclist differently when they're preparing for a Grand Tour?
Athletes who they are on that level, they have already massive base, and without base, no one can do such a stage race. And as far as training goes, it is not complicated. It is, as a matter of fact, maybe simplest thing to do is your training starts with loading phase. That loading phase has more volume than intensity, followed by week of recovery, we can call it, but still they do significant amount of volume during that recovery, and then race intensity, and followed by short of recovery phase before they start the race. Sometimes some athletes, they try to detrain before the start of stage, that they can get on the form middle of the tour. But some, they do opposite. If it's a time trial on beginning, they want to have a good time in GC, that they train a little bit differently. But generally speaking, is the volume, loading, unloading, race intensity, recovery, and start the race.
What sort of weekly volume are they doing?
Weekly volume, depending on the how far are they start before the race, it can be somewhere between 25 to 35 hours.
So a lot.
It is lots of hours on the bike. And it's not just 6 hours a day. It will be 2 days of 6 to 8 hours, and then followed by recovery day, and then build from there. There is building within building.
When you have an athlete in a Grand Tour and you're talking with them most days, what are you focusing on as the coach?
The athletes who race Grand Tour, at that level, they have full support, right? I play the role in preparation, but when the race is started, they are within their environment and within their support network within the teams. And those teams, they have one or two physiologists monitoring all the aspects of fatigue training. And I am not much involved at that stages. And what I find, because of amount of the support they have, less interference, less input from the coach, keep them more focused. And again, we are talking about athletes who they are doing this at least for 2 decades, more than 20 years. They know exactly what they are doing, and they know exactly how the body going to function.
Let's get back to the show and talk about the specific training for different rider types.
Maybe we should talk a little bit about the differentiation of the different types of riders, Ciaran. So if you could give us a sense of the training leading up to the tour for a GC contender versus a stage hunter versus a domestique. I'm sure they're pretty varied.
Yeah, massively varied. So start with the obvious GC contender. They're going to have a fair idea of where their numbers are leading into the tour from the preparation races, but they need to make sure that their long power, their sustainable power is up in a competitive bracket. And if it's not, they really need to work on getting that up, whether that's motor pacing, whether that's going out and doing an altitude camp. But it can change depending year on year, depending on how the rider is coming into each race. If everything has gone on track, then it could be a fairly easy to plan preparation, but most riders will have some sort of a setback, whether that's a crash, whether that's just a bit of illness that means they've come into some of the pre-tour stage races a bit, under par, so they need to then go away to altitude, go to a camp, and do some big blocks of work to get that 40-minute to an hour power up and able to do that repeatedly within stages.
Yeah, I was going to say that's the one number that I did see that just had my jaw drop. They did a physiological test on Chris Froome after he won his second Tour de France, and they were showing his sustainable, so that FTP or 40-minute, 1 hour power upwards of 6.4 to 6.7 watts per kilogram. It was just absolutely crazy.
Yeah, the sustainable power to weight ratios are pretty astronomical, and to be getting your rider up above sort of 6.2 watts per kilo, that's when you go from being an average run-of-the-mill pack rider to then knocking on the door of being a GC rider. So that's the sort of, if you can see that your rider's coming in above there, then you're cautiously optimistic. If they're well above there, then you're sort of rubbing your hands and saying, okay, this is a good sign.
So what about the stage hunter? Do they train differently from a GC rider?
Yeah, so a lot of them, I work with some stage hunters who will be at this Tour de France. A lot of it will be playing on their strengths, so knowing how they win stages. Usually stage hunters will perform in a very specific way. So, for example, winning sprints from a reduced bunch, or getting in the breakaway and motoring it and making sure that breakaway succeeds. So you might look back at previous stages that have won from previous years. A lot of it is replication. So looking at, okay, this guy has held 40 minutes on the last climb, but then they've done their highest 5-minute peak power output ever at the end of that. So it's slowly building up to that sort of level, so that when they get to the tour, or they get to the Grand Tour, they're able to do that. They're able to unlock that performance again. That it's not a huge jump from their norm, but from the client, from that breakaway stage hunter, anyone who's going through a stage win, usually you'll want to work on a kick or an attack. That's quite a key part of it, because you've either got to have the kick to get in the breakaway or to distance everyone else. There's no point being this big solid 1 hour power specialist if you can't get rid of anybody else, and you'll just tow everyone to the line and be pipped on the line. So that's probably the key focus for them.
So it almost sounds like the stage hunter would treat the tour in some ways like a one-day race. Like they'd have particular stages. They would say, that's a good stage for me, and really focus on that stage and build the assets they need for that particular stage to, as you said, deal with whatever the key climb is, and then have that kick to drop everybody at the end or at the beginning.
Yeah. They'll have looked at the profile from a long time out and put asterisks next to specific stages and say, okay, I want to perform here. This is a good stage for me. I've looked at the demands. It's similar to what I've performed well on before, and they might take it slightly easier the day before to kind of have fresher legs and really put all their eggs in that basket. But it can be tricky when the team has asked you to do something else the day before, and you need to spend more matches than you might want to. So it's important to have a good overall team plan going into a Grand Tour or even just a stage race to make sure that everyone's happy with what they're doing.
Now, what about the domestique, the person that's going to be spending a lot of time on the front in the wind and then finishing 20, 30 minutes down? What's their training like?
So for the domestiques in the Tour, a lot of the preparation will be sort of fairly standard, fairly similar to other stage races in the year. So there's nothing too specific that you might do, just making sure that their power outputs across the board are fairly high. So a lot of them will be spending a long time on the front of the bunch. So making sure that they're not coming in with too much fatigue, making sure that they're fresh, making sure that there's no niggling injuries or illnesses that we need to take care of. But their physiological point of view will be built up across the stage, because if they're a domestique in a Tour, they've probably been a domestique in most other stage races that they've been in that year. So it's kind of the culmination of lots of steps up across the year.
And then you wanted to talk a little bit about that real specialty event, the team time trial.
Yeah, the team time trial, it's a magnificent beast, especially if you've got quite a varied team. If you've got sprinters, if you've got a GC contender, and then also some domestiques, and if you've got one of everybody and some domestiques, then it can be quite a challenge to actually plan the TTT order and how long people are going to pull for at the front, because you want to maintain as high a average speed as you can. So, sometimes it can be that you designate your GC man to stay at the back and just say, okay, your job is today, just not get dropped. Don't go through and contribute. Don't spend matches. You're not going to be able to keep the speed at the level that we need, but we don't want you to lose time. So it can be quite an interesting one to plan for. But whenever you're riding a TTT bike that hard and that fast, even for these pro guys, it's always nervous. It's a super nervous day from the pro team point of view, because if something goes wrong, it affects your whole team. It's not like anyone else is safe. If there's a crash, it usually affects everyone else. So it can be a lot of stress, but a lot of good fun when it does pull off well.
All right. So now that we've discussed all of these demands and we've discussed how each different rider type prepares for the Tour, how does that all apply to us? Trevor, me, some mere mortals out there. What should we take away from the training and the preparation that goes into these pro riders' preparation for the Tour? And what shouldn't we take away from that? What shouldn't we do?
It goes without saying, these guys are professionals. This is their job to be training 100 hours a month and 30 hours a week and doing huge weeks. But for quote unquote us mere mortals, it would probably set us back more than it would drive us along to do that sort of training, because we're just not able to assimilate those adaptations that are being made by the stresses that we're putting your body under. Because you can, if you have a week off work, you can do a huge amount of volume in that week, but then to make quality adaptations from that, it's going to be extremely difficult, because next week you're back at work. There's a lot of stress. You'll probably get ill after doing something like that. But I'm sure most people will kind of be saying, "Oh, yeah, I remember the time that I had a big week and then I got sick the next Tuesday," or something like that. But it's always important just to be mindful of what your own limitations are. So if you know that you've got a very stressful job, to try to accommodate that and just tone it down more than you see these training rides that the pros do. Don't try to replicate them. Just do sort of 70% of what they're doing, and that will probably be a fairly decent training load for you.
Yeah, I think another important thing to bring up here when you're talking about the differences, and this is going to impact training, is we talked about the huge volume of a Grand Tour, which means any given rider in the Tour is going to be spending most of their time at pretty low intensity. And when they do their efforts, it's often pre-planned, but they're very specific and only when they really need to do those efforts. Where for the rest of us, you're doing a 2.5 hour race on a Saturday or a Sunday, it's not going to be quite that controlled. You can really expect you're going to go to that 2.5 hour race and it's going to be nonstop attacks, and you're not going to get a ton of time of actually going slow. So that is going to require a different type of training. And Ciaran, can you talk at all to that about what that sort of rider, those of us who are doing that nonstop attack 2-hour race versus the Grand Tour rider?
Yeah, the sort of really aggressive racing, which is that pure racing, which I like, which is actually something that you can kind of see the pros do in the Velon series, which is good fun to watch. But with regards to training for that, you don't need to be able to complete 3 weeks of racing to do a 2-hour crit. But in order to be doing those super high power outputs at the end of 2 hours, you've got to have been training for 3-4 hours at some point in your training cycle. It's going to be very difficult to perform at a super high level on anything lower than that. And that doesn't mean that every ride that you do in a week needs to be 3-4 hours, but you're going to need to have some aerobic base that hopefully you've built up over a couple of seasons. But the sort of development that you might see in your training come depending on when you're racing, but you'd come and you'd start with slightly higher volumes. And I'm going to pluck a duration, an average weekly duration off the top of my head, and just say, okay, if you're available to do 15 hours a week, maybe in the sort of base phase, you might be doing that full 15. But as you get closer to the races, you'll back down, and you might be doing a lot shorter, sharper efforts because you've already built that resilience, that sort of ability to push hard for 2 hours without those super high power outputs. But then when you back down the volume of your training and do the shorter intensity rides, your intensity goes up, your ability to hit higher peak power outputs will go, but you won't lose the ability to ride hard flat out for 2.5 hours.
No, it's a really good point. I also imagine something else that is critical to Grand Tour riders that they really have to work on, that if I'm just racing on a Saturday and that's my one race in a week, is far less important, is really that whole recovery side after the race.
Yeah, anyone who's done a sort of 3-day stage race or even a back-to-back stage race, once you get past that first day and you kind of you're into your second day, third day, you'll feel that your body's almost on a roll, and it's only after about 7 days when that fatigue starts to really hit you. And if you can get through a 5-day stage race without feeling like death, then it's pretty good going. But you will feel on those last 2 days that, yeah, I'm not feeling as bad as I thought, because your body's sort of in that sort of preparedness. If you're doing it day on day, your body's sort of ready, constantly ready for the next stimulus because it's already come. And that's where having replicated that sort of demand in a training environment, so that it's not a fresh demand on your body when you get to the race. So if you've done blocks, longer blocks of training, 5-day blocks where you've replicated, not necessarily to the same intensity, but replicated that day in, day out, riding, then when you get to the stage race, your body will be sort of more accustomed to it than it would if you've just done sort of the 2 to 3 day blocks as you go through your training cycle. So
you don't need to do the 40-hour training week that a Grand Tour rider is going to do, but what you can emulate is doing the 3 days in a row, teaching your body how to handle it when it's fatigued from the previous day.
Yeah, massively. So if you do short intervals, then do them back to back on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then have a rest day on a Friday, and then have a back to back day on the weekend. So it's sort of bunching up the rides to sort of link the physiological stress of those and try to mirror what your event demands are. So if you've got a multi-day stage race, take a look. Are there any shorter ones? Are there any longer ones? And try to undulate your week of training load based on what your event might look like. Then sort of get more and more sort of intensity specific as you get closer to the event itself.
So there is something, even for those of us who are doing a 2-3 day stage race, to train that fatigability, that resistance.
Yeah, I would say, even though it is 3-day stage race, it's going to be ridden flat out. So by the end of that third stage, there will be guys who haven't done that sort of back-to-back days just to acclimatize the body to it, and they'll be flagging because it's just unnatural for them. So if you've done blocks of riding before and hopefully over several seasons you've built that up and sort of done that more consistently, so by the time you get to your chosen goal event, it's going to be like another training event. So you've got nothing new coming out and sort of putting extra load on your body.
All right, you probably remember this from last time, Ciaran. We like to give you 60 seconds to encapsulate everything that we've spoken about today. Give the listeners a take-home message. So from today's episode, what would you say people should take home with them?
Grand Tours are hard. It's furiously hard. When you see the riders racing flat out for 21 days, there's a huge physiological impact that entails. But there's also the hidden side, which a lot of people don't really fully appreciate, which is that psychological aspect that they're constantly being bumped and barged by riders. So they're near on crashing every moment of the stage. And, the psychological stress of racing and performance, underperformance, and the demands of your sponsor. So that's the real sort of underappreciated side that I would want people to take home. And when they see the riders being a little bit arsey on interviews, to take that with a pinch of salt and say that's a culmination of a lot of stress that's coming out, because it's 21 days with very little downtime.
Trevor, what do you think? How would you add to that?
So I have two things. One is, I think there's a lot you can take from Grand Tour riders. I think there's a lot you shouldn't. If you are married and have a full-time job, don't try to do a 3-week stage race.
Unless you're a pro and you're getting paid to do it.
Don't try to train for one. Well, then it is a full-time job. To me, what really struck me is something that we've talked about a lot in this show, which is there is a whole bunch to bike racing that we can't really measure. And I think a Grand Tour is a really classic example of that. I intentionally quoted all those numbers to make the point. I look at those and go, I can do all those numbers. I also know if I was in the Tour de France, I wouldn't last 30 minutes. So all the things that make me not a tour rider and would just completely embarrass myself at a tour doesn't show up in the numbers, doesn't show up in Training Peaks or WK or whatever software you're using. So bear in mind, there is a lot to training that is hard to measure, that's hard to see, but that doesn't mean you still shouldn't focus on it. And one of them, as you said, is that fatigability, building that resistance, which is really important. Chris?
Yeah, I think this goes back to what Ciaran was saying about how daunting a task it is to think about racing for 3 weeks, and the quantity of time it has taken these athletes to get to a level where they can even complete such a task, let alone compete every day or be in the mix every day or stay out of trouble every day when you need to, and be at the front of the race when it comes to the summit finish if you're contending for the GC, and then be ready for that time trial the next day and all of these things. I don't know that anything that we could quote in terms of the data, in terms of the numbers, in terms of just talking about the multitude of stressors really encapsulates how hard the Tour de France is and all the demands that are there. Just thinking about how stressful it is as a journalist, and we get the buffet every night and then we go type some stories and get up the next morning and do it and drive around a little bit. But to be competing every day and be on your game for that long, dealing with all of those stressors, it's astounding to me. There's no take home in that message really, except be impressed, because it's an incredibly impressive athletic endeavor. That was another episode of Fast Talk. As always, we love your feedback. Email us at fasttalk@velonews.com. Subscribe to Fast Talk on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, SoundCloud, and Google Play. And be sure to leave us a rating and a comment. Become a fan of the Fast Talk on Facebook at facebook.com/VeloNews and on Twitter at twitter.com/VeloNews. Fast Talk is a joint production between VeloNews and Connor Coaching. The thoughts and opinions expressed on Fast Talk are those of the individual. For Ciaran O'Grady, Brent Bookwalter, Hushang Amiri, and that non-French guy, Trevor Connor, I'm Chris Case. Thanks for listening.